Friends of model trains, welcome to our new video. This video is about our Class 288 diesel locomotive and how to program it, because this locomotive has a few special features. What do I mean by that? Each half of the locomotive has its own decoder. One decoder has 4 as its address, and the second has 5 as its address, and both of these can be controlled together via the consist address 3. Why did we do that? Well, if for example the engine driver enters locomotive half 1 and switches on the driver's cab lighting there, then of course only the driver's cab lighting, or also the engine room lighting for this locomotive half 1 is on. The same holds true if the locomotive moves forwards and sounds the whistle, the signal horn. This is also only emitted from the half of the locomotive which is at the front in driving direction. To be able to switch these functions separately, we have the individual locomotive addresses for the individual functions and the consist address for the drive commands. We've had initial feedback from customers that this isn't so easy to deal with in practical application. What does this mean? In principle, we need 3 addresses to be able to control the locomotive conveniently. First we have the consist address, the address 3. Using this, we can for example make the locomotive move via the handheld controller. However, if you now try to select the signal horn, nothing happens. For this purpose, you first have to select the second address so that you can call up the signal horn. Of course, this makes handling somewhat more complex. Those that prefer to continue doing this, can do so, it functions just fine. But you can alternatively switch the functions conventionally by operating them using an address. This means that you simply have to reprogram the 2 decoders to be able to switch all functions again via a locomotive address. Here, too, we have 2 options. We can retain the consist address. This means that you drive using a common address and that you can switch all functions using this common address. Or you can switch off the consist address. Both locomotive decoders receive the same address, and you then only drive using one locomotive address, in the same way as for a single locomotive with one decoder. Both versions are feasible. Both versions function well, and I am going to explain both of them to you now. You can also find the description in the operating instructions included with the locomotive. Some people may find these too specific and complicated. So what I've done is simply copy page 24. Here it is explained how you can activate all the functions so that they can be called up via the consist address. The instructions explain that you can activate the function bitwise. What does bitwise mean? Well, it means that you can set each individual bit in order to activate each individual function. Basically, this means that if you write the value 255 in CV21, then all bits are activated and you can switch all functions from F1 to F8 via the consist address. In CV22, you have to enter the value 191, because you can't set bit 6 there. In this way you can program these 2 CV values and then call up all functions via the consist address. Many of you may know the term bitwise from the CV29. In CV29, you can set several functions for a locomotive. For example, you can reverse the driving direction or switch railcom on and off. This is also done here using these individual bits. CV21 and CV22 function according to a similar principle. You can program in more detail within the CV using the bitwise programming. The second version we have is when a consist address is stored in the CV19. This means that the consist address is activated if CV19 is larger than the value 0. It means that if CV19 is set to 1, then the locomotive address is 1. If CV19 is set to 15, then the locomotive address is 15. If you no longer need this consist address, then simply set the CV19 to 0 and assign both locomotive decoders to the same address via the CV1. This means that both halves of the locomotive receive the address 5, for example. You can then call up all functions via the CV1, the locomotive address 5. However, the advantage of the consist address is that you can control the locomotive completely using the consist address. once you have adapted the CV21 and CV22. You also have the option of switching the light functions of both locomotive halves separately. For example, if you set CV19 to 0, thereby deactivating the consist address, it is no longer possible to switch the light functions separately, but rather always together for both halves of the locomotive. Each person can decide for themselves which method suits them best. You can program this using any digital controller. I've got our Z21 start here. You can also use the new multi-mouse or the red mouse, the wireless LAN mouse or the Z21 control app, it really doesn't matter. And any other digital controller can also be used for normal CV programming, meaning that any digital controller you've got at home can be used to reprogram your locomotive. So here's my copy of page 24 from the operating instructions. If I want to continue to control the whole thing via the consist address, but also want to switch all functions via the consist address, then I just program CV21 to 255 and 22 to 191. Because you don't need bit 6 here, which is why we have a different value than in the CV21, where you have to set all bits from 1 to 7. To program, you should always only have one half of the locomotive on the track to ensure that clean programming commands arrive at the decoder correctly. To do this, you can separate the locomotive, but you don't have to. Either place the locomotive slightly offset to the tracks, or take a piece of paper or similar, lay it under one half of the locomotive and then you can program the other half. After that, I can swap my paper to the other half of the locomotive to program that one, too. To reprogram the CV values, you have to go into the programming menu with the mouse. As already shown in the Z21 videos, hold down the Shift key and menu and then go left once to reach Programming, before confirming with OK. Now you will see Change CV, confirm this again with OK. Now select CV21. Click OK. The CV21 is read out and 245 is shown. This value is changed to 255 and confirmed with OK. And now the same again, change CV, OK, CV22, OK. And here I enter the value 191 and confirm the whole thing again with OK. Now I've reprogrammed one half of the locomotive so that all functions can be controlled via the consist address. We can do the full procedure again for the second half of the locomotive. To do this, I take the locomotive half off the track, swap it onto the sheet of paper and place the other locomotive half on the track. This time I'll show you a second version. I'll use the tablet with the Z21 app this time to show you again how to reprogram using the app. To program the process using the app, we go to CV Programming, and then to Manual, and then Programming Track. You can set here which CV should be changed. The CV21, you can read this out and the value 249 is shown. These are the two bits which are missing. Now you can see that you have the value 255 and that it has to be set. Now switch to CV22. Here, too, you can read out the value and see that the 0 has been entered. We'll change this to 191. Now we've reprogrammed both locomotive halves and returned to CV19. Here the locomotive address 3 is still shown. If we've done everything right, all functions should now also be switchable via the locomotive address 3. Here we have adjusted the locomotive address 3 and can see that the whistle, which previously only functioned on address 4 or 5, now functions on address 3. This is also the case if you go into the second level using Shift and want to switch on the engine room lighting. You'll see that the lights go on in both locomotives. It's the same for the driver's cab lighting and also the control cabinet lighting, all of it functions via one single address. Of course, the drive function works too, the locomotive runs. The sound can also be controlled appropriately via an address. That's version 1. Here the locomotive is controlled via the consist address. However, if you don't want to use the consist address, but rather want to control the locomotive using the classic method via CV1, then set the CV19 to 0. This deactivates the consist address and then you can control the locomotive via CV1. Let's have a look at this process. To deactivate CV19, so basically to change back to the normal address, set the value 0 in CV19. To do this, we need to have only one half of the locomotive on the track, and remove the other half. We're using the mouse again, hold down the Shift key. Press the programming menu, OK, change CV, OK, and then enter the CV19. You will see the address 3, enter the value 0 and press OK. Now the consist address in this locomotive half is deactivated. Because each locomotive half is ultimately to be controlled via the same address, you can reprogram one half of the locomotive at the same time. To do this, press Menu and press 1 for the locomotive address. The locomotive should now receive the address 5, and therefore CV1 must be assigned the locomotive decoder with the correct address. Then the whole process has to be run through again for the second half of the locomotive. Now the second half is placed onto the track. If the CV19 is read out and the address 3 shown, then this value has to be set to 0 again. This means that the consist address is deactivated. Then the address 5 must be entered in the CV1. Now we've reprogrammed both locomotive halves and can check whether the locomotive can be controlled. For this purpose, we have to switch from the programming menu into the drive menu. The locomotive with the address 5 has already been selected, and now you can control the locomotive. You can see that the function can be switched appropriately and that you can control both halves of the locomotive simultaneously. One final tip, on some controllers from other manufacturers, for example the EcoS and also the Central Station, you may experience problems because the locomotive wants to register as an MFX locomotive. This means that the locomotive halves register separately from each other. It's more expedient to register the locomotive halves separately from each other. To do this, program the CV12 to the value 53 in the respective locomotive halves. This deactivates the MFX. Otherwise, MFX is set to pre-01 on these controllers, which means that first this format is detected when the locomotive comes onto the track. And this leads to problems with the two separated locomotive decoders, which is why the CV12 has to be set to the value 53 to deactivate MFX. Then just file the locomotive manually as DCC to obtain all functions without any problems. After that, programming the controller is no problem. And that was it from me on the new Class 288 double diesel locomotive. Thanks for tuning in and see you next time.